All right, we are back, and Frank Bumb has returned to the podcast for part 2 of our discussion on Stannis Baratheon.
You can't get rid of me.
No, we would. You're like just like Stannis. You can't get rid of Stannis, right?
Or a bad penny, whichever analogy you want to go with.
Yeah. Okay, I that's probably a better analogy for you. So in part 1, we talked about George's focus on the human heart and conflict. We compared Stannis to some historical and fictional characters, and we analyzed how he and his allies could win the Battle of Ice and free Winterfell. Today, we're going to focus solely on the man himself, Stannis Baratheon. So I want to go through some questions I have, and I'd like you guys to answer these. Let's talk pretty much about Stannis, every aspect of Stannis that we can think of here. First, I want to talk about the fact that George writes in a POV structure. We all know that Stannis isn't a POV. Do you think that contributes to the fact that a lot of people either don't like him or, as we think, misunderstand him?
I mean, possibly, in that we don't get his motivations, and we judge others kind of on their actions, and we judge ourselves on our intent because we have our own point of view. But on the flip side of that, he has possibly the most sympathetic POV character ever for him, in that he has Davos, who basically worships him, who even after the deaths of his sons is still willing to follow him to hell and back. And so I think, Davos had an opportunity to, the Manderleys fake his death. Davos can very well, say, well, everybody thinks I'm dead, I'm just going home.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the evidence points very much to him actually going to Skagos to retrieve Rickon. So he's literally going into cannibal-infested territory, Cannibal Island, for Stannis. So, and that's the lens in which is the most visions we get of Stannis. So on the one hand, us not having him as a POV means we don't get his internal perspective on things, but on the other side of things, we get the most favorable possible.
I think that's a great point. You're right. Davos is very sympathetic. Just as a quick aside, there is a theory that I don't remember who posited at first. There is a theory that Davos will on Skagos hear that Stannis is dead. Obviously, we think that's a fake out. And then he will also hear that the Golden Company has landed in the Stormlands. And someone believes that Davos will go south to save his wife and little Stannis, his son, that's there, basically thinking the king's dead, my mission is done. I don't subscribe to that. I think that he's going to see Stannis' assignment through, probably, even if he thinks he's dead.
Yeah,
what do you guys think?
I can very much see that series of events playing out with Davos abandoning Stannis to go save his family because of the Golden Company, possibly taking his family prisoner because he's the hand of the king, of a hostile king. So I think that series of events could play out, but I think it happens after Davos returns Rickon, because I think Davos does have to return Rickon because of the implications for the Winterfell plot.
Okay.
And the northern ambitions, and maybe not the northern ambitions, but the grand northern conspiracy that has been written about on Reddit and done very well on Reddit.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Brett, anything to add on that?
No, I think you nailed it. So
okay, so we just talked about Davos being a very sympathetic character, and that's the person that we see Stannis through. Why do you think George chose Davos, both as a point of view character, but also as the lens for which we see Stannis Baratheon?
Well, on one hand, I think it's it showcases Stannis at his best when Stannis has his impulses of the duties that he owes to the people beneath him, and his lack of concern for pomp and circumstance, and his lack of caring about he's very close to a meritocratic ideal. And obviously, he's in a feudal society. He wants to be king, so he's not going to introduce democracy anytime soon. But the fact that he views social mobility as something that you can do for people who do their duty, it is definitely Stannis at his best.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think another part of it is just, and this has been talked about by a lot of people in the fandom, is George knows exactly how far you can push Stannis to be unlikable and then pull him back.
Mm-hmm.
And Davos is the best mechanism to do that with, because Davos is so sympathetic, so endearing, and one of the good people in the story.
It's weird too, because Davos, obviously Ned or Stannis is he's compared to Ned a lot, and then but he's more willing to do some like grayish, too evil kind of stuff for, he's very much kill one to save a million. And then Davos has to, kind of pull him back and, tell him like, no, that's not, you are, I don't know. Like, so I don't know. Davos is an interesting character. Well, I mean, he is, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know really where I'm going with that. It's just interesting to me. Their dynamic, and just how like Stannis, is a lot like Ned, but will do stuff that, Ned would never think about. But then you've got a guy that's like not even like, his past is not like Ned at all, but he's less gray than Stannis pretty much. So, and has to keep him in check. And Stannis, I don't know, like the fact that Stannis like listens to him is like very telling too. So
yeah, and part of the thing that maybe kind of gets lost in this because of the show and their portrayals is that Davos is actually 4 years younger than Stannis. So it could very much be kind of an older brother, younger brother type relationship, which Stannis obviously never got from Renly. And touching on that relationship for a second, Renly's like 12 years younger than Stannis. So,
Yeah.
and I think that plays into their dynamic, where if you could imagine being like 35 and having your 22-year-old brother coming in and basically trying to steal your job and kill you too. Let's not ignore that. But yeah, so I think that definitely becomes Davos is the little brother that Stannis always wanted, in that he does his duty, he does repent from kind of his, wrong, quote unquote, lifestyle from a smuggler, and becomes a good knight, good lord, and ultimately a good hand of the king.
Well, that's. Go ahead, Brett.
Well, this one's a little off topic, but if Stannis would have just been like, okay, Renly, do whatever, because Renly offers him Storm's End. Renly could, have potential children, but I think Renly just wanted to be king. Like, so like if he went first, if he became king and then Stannis used the shadow baby on him, years down the road before he has a child or whatever, then he's next in line and they're not warring. Like, they could have taken down the Lannisters together and then he could have done that. So
I don't think.
I mean, I don't think Stannis conceives of things in that way.
No, I don't think. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think for him it doesn't jive, especially because also Stannis knows that Renly is plotting with the Tyrells and he's not a fan of the Tyrells. So I think that would be a difficult thing for him to do, and also it doesn't work with his personality and how he conceives of his role as king.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he is very by the books. Now that I think about it, well, I should have thought about it before I said that, but yeah.
Well, and that's a good segue into the next question, which is, why is there this significant divide between the Baratheon brothers. Let's stay on Renly and then let's go to Robert. And I think you appropriately said it, Frank, that there's such this gap in age between them. Stannis took care of Renly at Storm's End during the siege. Renly was obviously a 5-year-old boy, 6-year-old boy, something like that, very young.
Yeah, the math works out to, like, if I remember right, it's in the 4, 5, or 6 range.
Yeah. His older brother at 18 or 19, right, is holding the castle against the might of the Reach, subsisting on boot leather and rats and, everything that they have to do to survive. And there's some great analysis in this fandom based on the survivors of Robert's Rebellion, the people who lived through Robert's Rebellion, that a lot of them are suffering not simply from PTSD, but from some of the choices that they made during that conflict. Stannis lived through that conflict. He had a major role in that conflict. Renly did not. So do you think there's sort of a we can understand why Stannis is not necessarily like Robert or like Ned or like Tywin or whatever, but he has that formation of his adulthood set in a war, and Renly was just kind of, there. Sure, he probably understood to an extent what was going on, but it didn't affect him. There wasn't really a heaviness on Renly that there was on Stannis. I think that could also lead to the divide between them as well.
Go ahead, Brett.
It definitely can. And I think age too. Basically, being so much younger. I mean, you think of someone growing up in the, 80s as opposed to growing up in the 90s, there's obviously a difference there, but then also they're in kind of they've got two different interests too, like, or all three of them really. And they never kind of really grew up together, even Stannis and Robert didn't really grow up together. So it doesn't seem like they really formed a bond. And I think, there probably was some like good moments between Robert and Stannis, but like if you didn't really grow like a kind of bond with your siblings at, like as a younger person, or growing up, of course, if you don't like him, you're going to remember like bad memories and you're going to be like, okay, I don't like him. And then one time, he made fun of Proudwing, and that's what Stannis holds on to. But if they had actually like grown like a brotherly bond, it would be more like Ned. And Ned, like what Ned recalls is, Robert being, laughing all the time, being built, whatever, like a maiden's fantasy or something. And you could kind of see like Ned think if every time you get a Ned point of view, he's like, oh, this isn't the Robert I once knew. But if you talk to Stannis would probably be like, that's always been Robert, So,
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for kind of the Girls Gone Canon episodes where they talk their first 2 episodes where they talk about Ned and Robert being kind of victims of the rebellion and the trauma, and they've never kind of been able to grow past that. And then specifically in their second episode, and I'm kind of cribbing from them when I say that, they say that Robert is kind of frozen in time from when he was kind of this athletic frat boy jock, very gregarious, but not having a lot of responsibilities. And that's who he is in the moment that the Wind Proud breaks up, that I talked about kind of in, this episode before the break, was that, and that's true for Stannis, in that he is very much kind of the moody goth. But then turning to the Siege of Storm's End and that relationship with Renly, and I don't know if George is in depth, but when it comes to starvation at that young of age for Renly, where he would have been about 3 or 4 when it's happening, you use the example I'd use is the siege of Leningrad in the Soviet Union during World War II. Children there, compared to other places that didn't suffer starvation even during the Nazi invasion, they're much smaller. And you actually see that. Another example would be the difference in height and stature between South Koreans and North Koreans because of the North Korean famine in the 90s. And so I say that to say that Renly is described as basically young Robert, as tall, as muscular, as fully built out as him. So, but we know that Stannis was starving in that. So the image comes to mind implicitly, and this might not have been the case, but it sounds like Stannis was making sure that Renly was being fed.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and so
I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did. Like,
yeah, because again, Stannis is described as tall as Robert, but not nearly as robust, and so that becomes the question of, was that dynamic in play, and does that add to the bitterness that Stannis feels at Renly's, and I'm going to call it a betrayal because it is,
right?
At me, haters. But yes, that's so I think that's a kind of a dynamic. But another part of it is, and again, this is pointed out by other people, is that they're very similar. There is no uncharismatic Baratheon. Robert is famous for it, but Stannis is kind of on the sidelines with it. But his charisma comes in for the common man, for the lords, not so much for the lords, but there are lords that are very much devoted to him, Davos being the best example. But he's got the charisma for his, lesser troops. I don't want to say lesser, wrong.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, it's said in that Asha chapter that there's this devotion from the common soldier to their commander.
Yeah, and then Renly obviously is very charismatic in his own, way. And although I think that his charisma kind of gets overplayed because he's, people were like, "Oh, he brought the Tyrells to his side." And it's like, well, the Tyrells were using him, so let's ignore that part about it. But during the Hands Tourney, Renly is described as being a good favorite of the commons, and he does have, kind of the sense of throwing some of the gold that breaks off from his helm into the stands. So he's very good at the performance of being charismatic, and ultimately he is. But again, that's all there is to Renly. He's a ghost in a golden crown.
Building off of what you said, Frank, I didn't think about this, but and I'm not sure. That could have just been something George overlooked. But it does make perfect sense that Stannis did feed him, and maybe made sure he was fed, made sure, they had an heir, or, made sure that at least Renly would survive that siege. And maybe the divide came afterwards when Robert gave Storm's End to Renly, and that's when Stannis kind of became bitter and started he distanced himself from both of them. He was bitter. He just couldn't get over it. And then that's when maybe their relationship kind of died. Maybe they would have had like a really good relationship with each other if it had not been for that.
I think the relationship between Robert and Stannis is that's a good theory. Yeah, that's a good theory for like Stannis and Renly.
Yes,
Renly taking it, and just to kind of look at Robert for a second, that, like as I said in the previous, bit of this episode, the relationship is probably not redeemable once Storm's End goes to Renly between Robert and Stannis, but the fact that he even did that is a bad indication. The fact that he never thanked Stannis in Stannis's words, and maybe Robert did, but Stannis just doesn't remember it. But I think he would, simply because that's all he craves.
And like another thing too is once if that is correct, what I'm kind of thinking that would make sense why they're divided. Like when if you don't have that bond and you just quit being a part of that person's life as they grow, they're going to change into whoever they want. And it's probably what happened was they were like, oh, you look like Robert, you're young Robert, like you're just going to be just like Robert. and he probably grew into like an egotistical, very shallow person. And then as an adult, Stannis doesn't like that kind of person. So at that point, he doesn't like Renly, and Renly's personality is not going to change at that point. Renly's he is who he is. He's very vain. But yeah, so I think that's probably the case. Yeah. And I hope George did think about that, like Renly being big, and because it could have just been something he just didn't even think about.
No, I think it's definitely something he think about because he thought about. It's definitely something he thought about because Renly is meant to be a ghost of Robert, but also a ghost in so many other ways, in that there's nothing there beyond just the performance of being a king. He doesn't realize what it is.
I think you're probably on the right path. I also think that Stannis is probably described as he is, or looks the way he does, also to kind of make him seem like a more darker character. He's sinewy. He's still muscular, but he's kind of a lean muscle. He's got not the robust hair that Renly and Robert have. He has basically a thin line of hair around a bald head. We're going to talk a little bit in just a minute about how that's described, because I think it's an interesting point that George makes. He's got these, dark eyes, which all of the Baratheons do, but he's got these sharp jaws or sharp cheeks and everything. I think he's also kind of made that way by George just to make you take a second guess at him, especially in the context of Melisandre and what some of the things he does in the story.
Yeah.
So let's stick to specifically to Robert here. We've talked at length about Robert and Stannis here and in the other part. I want to talk about Stannis's political skills, and then I want to go to his military and command and strategy. Why isn't Stannis a better politician? Why doesn't he have better political skills? And we'll define what we mean by that. So the Lord Stefan and Lady Kasana die on the Windproud. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like Robert and Stannis are like 15 and 14 or 14 and 13, something like that. Maybe 16, 15. Anyways.
I thought Stannis was, it said it was just shy of a year younger or something. So it was something like that. He's like a year younger
than Robert, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So at some point, and the timeline's a little iffy on exactly when Robert goes to the Vale. I don't think it's necessarily known if Stefan had already sent him to the Vale. I mean, he's standing atop Storm's End watching his parents die. He could have been home.
That's when Robert is 15 and Stannis is 14.
Okay.
And I believe by that time, and I can check real quick, but I believe by that time he had been fostered in the Eyrie.
Okay.
Yeah, because after reaching manhood, Robert divided his time between Storm's End and the Eyrie, but then back into when he's 15, that's when when he's 16. It's actually a 2-year gap between the two. So when he's 16 is when you see the Windproud breaking up in Shipbreaker Bay.
Okay. But at some point, Robert goes back to the Vale. It sounds like he, still divided his time between Storm's End and the Vale, even after his father dies. So Stannis essentially is at Storm's End. Is he Lord of Storm's End? Is he acting as Lord of Storm's End? Is Crescent doing that? And if so, I don't think Bran is a great comparison, but the fans will know that when Robb leaves the North, Bran assumes the lordship of Winterfell. Obviously, he doesn't have the time that Stannis has, because if we're talking about, an age of 14 or 15, the siege of Storm's End doesn't happen until Stannis is 18. So he's got like 2 to 3 years where he's technically the Baratheon in Storm's End. I'm just trying to figure out why he, and maybe it's there and we just don't know about it, but why he didn't develop more political skills there, and especially soft political skills, the skills like you talk about that Renly has.
Well,
it's just he doesn't care. He doesn't care about him. He hates. I think he just hates, like just when like fakeness. He likes everything straightforward, and he just doesn't. He probably understands it because he kind of seems like he does. Later on in the books, like he does understand it. He just has a huge distaste for it, and would rather just not. I mean, like even with the Karstarks, like I think it's in the sample chapters, he was like, telling whichever Karstark, he's like, what he starts the sentence off by like, you're all dead men, but how you die is up to you. And like, so he's straightforward. He didn't try to be like, oh, if you give me certain information, I'll let you off. And then kills him anyway. He didn't even lie to him. Like, he's like, this is how you're gonna die. If you tell me, if you don't give me what you want, you're gonna die like this. And if
I think that's a fair point, but I think it's also, the context is, these are his enemies. Those people are traitors to him. I'm talking more about
like flattery.
And I get it. I get the fact that he doesn't like that type of leadership, that type of acting. I'm just asking, does he have these soft political skills and chooses not to use them, or does he just hate them so much, or did he not learn them? I would think Crescent, again, he's there 2 or 3 years somewhat by himself at Storm's End. I'm just trying to figure out why he didn't learn that more.
I think he does know him, but he probably just never cared about him, so he just didn't keep practicing them. But go ahead. I mean, that's all I really got for it. So
my perspective on this is it kind of, when people say Stannis doesn't have political skills, I think it's kind of an irrelevant question, because the reason the Lords of Westeros don't like Stannis is that he's not down with their notions of ruling. Specifically, he doesn't think that the peasants are a piggy bank that you just get to keep exploiting over and over again. And again, I don't want to whitewash him and pretend that he's some champion of the people, because he's not. He does believe in an absolute monarchy. But he is one of the few people in this series who conceive of their obligations as going both ways. Yes, you as peasants and commoners and knights and lesser lords have a duty to provide me with resources, with manpower for my wars, and with everything else. But I, as a lord, have a duty to you to be a just king, to enforce the laws, not at my whim, but as they're, as they're written, and maybe not written, but codified through custom. And he's one of the only people who takes that seriously. And so you see it, and people like to point to Stannis saying that he wants to outlaw the brothels in King's Landing. And everybody takes this as like, oh, he's this, puritanical person who wants people to just stop having sex because he's uncomfortable with it. And my question is, who runs the brothels?
Right.
It's Littlefinger. He's my from my read of it is that there's no other instance where Stannis is that puritanical in regards to sex for other people. He does geld rapists, but for him, that's a violation of people who are not enemies, or people who were enemies but can't defend themselves against you. And it's also a discipline matter, because if you let people, as Tywin does, let your army go around raping, it's a discipline matter. But it's for him, it is enforcing his obligations downward.
Mm-hmm.
which is something. But going back to the issues of puritanical he's not trying to do that in King. My belief is that he's not trying to do that in King's Landing because he wants people to stop having sex. Because Robert's his king. What's he going to do?
Right.
But he's trying to do that so he can undercut Littlefinger's money stream. Because at this point, Stannis knows what Littlefinger is about. And so he just isn't able to do that because, again, Robert's his king and he's going to listen to Littlefinger on matters of money, and also because Robert himself is a great purveyor of them. So he has these political skills, but it's kind of an irrelevant question, because if Stannis were a blunt asshole, but he was always supporting the lords in their exploitation, in their benefits, in not doing reforms, in not bringing smugglers to the high table, I don't think the lords would care. Because, like Randall Tarley, does Randall Tarley have a reputation among the lords that's negative? No, because Randall Tarley helps the lords exploit the common soldiers. So I think, and Ned, for example, he doesn't have a bad reputation amongst the lords, and that's a reason for that is because the northern culture is so much different than the southern culture, and we see Stannis again doing very well politically in the northern culture when he goes to recruit the northern clans, and we talked about this in the Dany episode.
That is a very good point.
That again, whether it was he followed Jon's path in complimenting the daughters, in praising the bravery of their sons, in eating their food, or was it him going up there and saying, look, I am your king, but I'm not going to order you to fight with me, but I'm going to go kill the Freys and Boltons. Do you want in?
Yeah.
I personally think it was the latter, but again, the fact is he does much better in a northern culture that deals well with Ned's blunt style and lack of lack of flowery courtesies, but he doesn't do as well on the southern. And when you flip their positions, when Stannis goes north and when Ned goes south, both of them their fortunes kind of change.
That is such a good point. That is a great point. And that could be another hint that Stannis is going to end up being the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. At some point.
I think he's gonna die, but
that's
another question.
That's a question later on.
Well, I mean, yeah, okay,
yeah. So, let's move from political skills to military strategy. Okay. Is Stannis a great military commander and strategist?
Yes. Next question.
Yeah.
It's not close.
Let's revel in the evidence, Frank. Let's go through.
The evidence is just so overwhelming.
There's a question within the evidence that I want to ask, because I thought it was an interesting point that someone else made. So let's just go through this real quick. We've got the Siege of Storm's End. We've already talked about that. We've got the defeat of the Ironborn at sea, which I think is probably his greatest achievement militarily, I believe.
Yeah.
The taking of Dragonstone, that seems like, the Targaryens were defeated, their royal fleet was smashed in the storm, but there were a lot of elements still on Dragonstone. I mean, if the fans out there have read Fire and Blood, we know there's a lot of Targaryens, there's a lot of Targaryen bastards probably still on Dragonstone. So he was commanded to go capture Daenerys and Viserys. Obviously, he failed in that, but he took the castle, he took the island, and then obviously becomes lord of it. The fact that he goes to Sweet Sister, and actually, I hadn't realized that he went himself. I may have misread that. But he goes to Sweet Sister to order them and the pirates not to damage ships and destroy ships on the rocks, etc. Before he becomes master of ships, we don't know that he was a great sailor. So I think the achievements that he has at sea and as master of ships is pretty significant.
Yeah.
But military strategy, focusing on the Battle of Blackwater and Stannis's decision to go to Storm's End first. So if anyone out there follows Jim, also known as Something Like a Lawyer on Twitter, I think he's a co-contributor to the Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog. First of all, follow him. He's great, very knowledgeable guy, both on politics and military. But he described, and I think this was on the Boiled Leather audio hour a few months ago, he described that Stannis in this scenario of, about the incest, Robert is dead, Ned is dead, we've got to take King's Landing, yet he goes to Storm's End. Jim describes this as a no-win scenario, that the political versus the military solution, a no-win scenario. Basically, like in chess, he's forced to make a move. But was it the right one? Was it right to go to Storm's End first instead of just striking for King's Landing and overwhelming them?
Well, I don't think they could have overwhelmed King's Landing based on the forces he has there, because when Renly comes to the parlay with his vanguard, I believe Renly's arriving with something like 20,000 just mounted troops, because he leaves his infantry host at Bitterbridge.
Right, there's about 60,000 still behind him, right? Yeah.
So we're dealing with a much larger force that Renly has, and Stannis has it's less than 10,000 that he has to.
Yeah, I think it's like 7 maybe.
Yeah, something like that. And I think Renly, when he was being a dick during the parlay, he says, "I'll call it 5,000 and say I'm being generous." So the notion of 5,000 men being able to take a city of 500,000 people, I mean, maybe you could, because they're not all military, but the Gold Cloaks alone, I believe, number 2,000.
Yes.
So it wouldn't be difficult because at this point, Tywin Lannister is not entirely bottled up at the, in the north. So you don't, if Stannis sails directly for King's Landing, and then Renly comes and says, "I'm king," and he's only got 5,000 people who are reduced by whatever their casualties were in storming a very well fortified walled city, and then the massive Red Keep, and then Maegor's Holdfast. I don't even know if he could pull that off. And then there's also the Mel wild card, because Mel, at this point, Stannis is aware of her abilities when it comes to prophecy. She can see her death in the flames. I'm sure they had a conversation about what happened with Crescent, that she saw in her flames that Crescent was coming to kill her. So he has no reason to disbelieve her when she says he needs to go to Storm's End in order to prevent Renly from coming out and killing him, because she said that, because Mel gets that prophecy wrong, because Mel thinks that by going to Storm's End and killing Renly, you prevent Renly's host from smashing him beneath the walls of Storm's End. But Mel saw that as an alternate future you can prevent, when that ended up being the right prophecy because they go to Storm's End.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, it's the trick of prophecy and the dangers therein, which we see with Cersei, which we see with Dany. But at the same time, in terms of just secular reasons, Stannis can't let Renly pretend that Stannis is going to back him as king. Because Renly's telling everyone, "Well, I'm declaring myself king," and everyone's immediately going, "Well, what about Stannis?" And he's saying, "Oh, no, my brother's going to support me." And so Renly actually takes it as a shock, because Catelyn is there when Renly gets the message that Storm's End is besieged, and then they tell him it's Stannis. And even the Lannisters are caught off guard by that. So I think, the account you were referring to is definitely right, in that it's a no-win situation. But I think of the options, based on the evidence he has with Mel, based on the political situation, and then just based on the military situation, Storm's End is the best thing. And I think, this is probably the most fanboyish opinion I have about Stannis, but I honestly think he could have defeated Renly's vanguard, because you see it in the War Council, where Renly's lords are saying, "Well, we're going to be riding right into the sun." They apparently have been building ditches and stakes, and I think his archers were getting ready to Agincourt them. So, and there's an essay on Wars and Politics of Fire and Ice, I believe, that goes into this, that Stannis was, and this is also good evidence that, Stannis didn't know about Mel's shadow baby for Renly. Obviously, he knows about it for Courtney Penrose, but if he's preparing to take on Renly's vanguard, why would he do that if he knows that he's got Mel as an ace in the hole? So, but yeah. So militarily, politically, and then magically with Mel, I think Storm's End has to be the move for him.
I was going to mention the whole Storm's End thing, because I don't know if it was in the notes about how you think that battle would have went, but you just kind of summed it up.
Yeah. Well, and we just talked about his political skills, and I actually think there's the notion that if Stannis showed up at King's Landing, and he didn't have any of his people with him. I mean, he's got his army from Dragonstone. He's got some houses from the Crown Lands. But doesn't it look a lot better politically for you to have the Stormlanders behind you, Baratheon soldiers behind you? So from a political angle, it makes sense to, you want to secure your home, right? You don't want your home open to someone else holding it, someone else controlling it. That could, politically turn against you very easily.
Yeah. It's like, like if there's like a civil war that breaks out wherever, you don't want to be on one side and go, hey, we're going to invade this country now. Like, that just doesn't make sense. So each region is kind of like its own country. So it makes sense to secure that. And then, because it probably has a bunch of defensible positions too. If that's secured, you can't get invaded. I mean, you can, but you'd be better off, having that whole region. So
is Edric Storm part of the reason Melisandre pushes him as well to go to Storm's End? Okay,
Stannis says Melisandre needs the boy.
Yeah.
At this point, I don't my understanding is Stannis.
Yeah.
Also, Stannis wants Edric to use him as evidence of, look, this is what Robert's kid looks like.
Again, that's a political maneuver there.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
He wants them for legitimacy, for when he takes King's Landing, to have the public line up the Lannister kids and then line up, Edric Storm and be like, because they're about the same age. And so, because Edric is a teenager, he's robust, and Joffrey's about that age. So if you line those kids up and say, these are not, one is not like the other. Yeah, the little song and dance. You can do that. Mel wants the boy for a barbecue. So that's kind of the reason why Mel's pushing it so hard. But again, that's another reason for Stannis to want to go to Storm's End.
Yeah. All right. So my next question that I want to ask everyone, because this really gets thrown around in the fandom, especially those people who do not like Stannis. Does ambition drive Stannis, specifically ambition for the throne?
No. Well, not maybe, but not in the way people think. Like, he doesn't want to be king to be king. He thinks he needs to be king because it's his rights by law. And I think we've kind of scratched the surface with everything, but he does see like mistreatment. He sees these lords abusing their power, and he wants to set them straight. I think if the law is the law, everybody has to abide by that law. Like, even if you're a king to a noble or to a peasant, you have to follow that law. And I'm sure, I think, and then that gets changed because he's like, king has to defend the realm, and he knows about the threat in the north. So he goes north. So I think it's more like that. It's not like the way Renly wants it. He just wants a crown on his head, and he wants people like kissing his feet and stuff. Just that kind of. He wants to be pampered because he's the king. That's what Renly wants, and that's what. Joffrey just wants to be king because he likes the power, and likes to abuse people, and the list can go on. So I guess it's ambition, but in a better way, I guess. But yeah.
So for me, with Stannis's ambition is recognition. He does have an ambitious streak, but it's not. I think Stannis, if you could ask him, if you could actually get an honest answer for him, is that he doesn't. His ideal situation would not be to be king.
Well, yeah, he even
It
said
would be to be the hand of the king to Robert, and to have Robert go, "Oh, what a marvelous job you've been doing running the kingdoms," because ultimately Robert is the figure that haunts Stannis, whose recognition he never gets. And so now that Robert is dead, he does believe himself to be king. So he is ambitious in this circumstance of that. But ultimately, if he was ambitious, and this is the ultimate evidence that he's not ambitious, if he was ambitious after, Blackwater, everyone talks about, well, what's Stannis going to do next? And Tywin and Tyrion and everyone else say, well, he could sail for Dorne to rise them. He could try and raise the Stormlords. He could even go to Essos and try and raise troops over there. No one outside of Dragonstone thinks he'll go north. And then when he goes north, everyone is confused by it because they don't see it as the move to make if you're trying to gain the throne. Because it's not the move to gain the throne. It is, as Stannis says to Jon Snow, Davos tells him that doing this is trying to, protect the kingdom in order to win the throne. Whereas before he was trying to win the throne to protect the kingdom. Right. So that's kind of the choice that he ultimately makes. And he rejects Claw Isle out of hand, because if it was ambitious, he could go to Claw Isle. He would get a ton of resources there because it's described as overflowing with riches, with, that sorcerer's horn, with wine and all these other things that he can boost the morale of his troops, that he can pay off Salador Saan. So if all he cares about is ambition, he goes to Claw Isle, where he tries to raise Dorne, or he tries to raise the Stormlords, or he goes to Essos. The fact that he goes north is the ultimate rebuttal against the notion that he's ambitious. And the people who say, well, he had no choice but to go north, is directly contradicted by the text, because Martin has multiple people saying in that council room, saying here are all his options, but he chooses the one that isn't ambitious.
I think that drives perfectly well into the next question, which is, would Stannis be a good king?
I think so. I mean, I don't think he'd be perfect, but I think he would be. I'm not really thinking too much about like what his law, like, what changes he'd make, but as far as wanting to do the greater good and being very competent, he's probably not as radical as I would like him to be, but and probably in a different way. But I wouldn't say he'd probably be like the greatest king to ever live, but I think he would do a solid job. So.
Yeah, with that, when I look at this question, I look at it in two contexts, and I look at it with context of the story that we're in, and without context, and just in general. And so the context of the story is that the others are coming.
Right.
But the wall is going to be breached, and you're going to have the army of the dead coming through the wall, and there's really nobody else you would rather want to be king in that situation. You don't want Tywin Lannister because A, his military reputation is inflated, and B, he doesn't give a shit about the peasants who are going to be slaughtered by this, which again is stupid because then that increases the other's army. You don't want Cersei, you don't want Joffrey, Robb maybe, but battles are going to be less important than sieges for this kind of conflict. So, Stannis's knowledge of logistics, what it takes to feed an army, what it takes to survive in these hostile situations. In the context of the others coming, there's literally no one else you would rather have be king in the entire books, in my opinion. Not Aegon, not Jaehaerys, not anybody. Next, without context, just in general, would his philosophy work as a king? I think it would, because one, he's anti-corruption, which is why if you judge Stannis on his enemies, Littlefinger, Varys, the Tyrells, the Lannisters, that's something that is very telling, that those are the people who view him as a mortal threat. Then another factor is the rule of law moving from the whim of the ruler, where the law is whatever I say, versus a formalistic approach where the laws bound the ruler as much as they bound the common man. And if you look at the progression of medieval feudal societies in Europe, when you get away from kind of that sort of corruption as endemic to the society, and I'm not saying post-feudal societies don't have corruption, obviously they do, but when you get away from the feudal notions of exploitative feudal corruption by the lords, and also moving to a codified system of laws that's formalistic, that also binds the rulers, that's really when you get a large degree of advancements in governments and ultimately the societies in Western Europe. And so those two things are very much in Stannis' favor of for his if he became steward of the Seven Kingdoms.
Yeah, that's great. I agree with you, Frank, that I think that there are two ways you have to look at it. Both the fact that Stannis is going to be the one to marshal the defenses against this invasion, unlike any other king could be able to do it. And then the fact that he's bound by a code, and that code is not only something that he takes very personal, but it's also something that would greatly benefit the common man and the system itself. Speaking of kings, let's talk about someone who would be a really terrible king, in our opinion, the betrayer, Renly Baratheon. Usurper. That's fine. Usurper, betrayer, whatever. Why did he betray Stannis, and was it a difficult thing for Stannis to deal with? And I want to just really briefly talk about the quote where Stannis is confronted with why he chose Robert over Aerys, the Mad King. He has that famous line where he says, "My brother or my king." Stannis said when talking about the choice that he made, and he references the fact that you don't know how hard that was. He talks about there being older laws than just your duty to your liege lord. The fact that a younger brother respects an elder brother, follows an elder brother in family. And he says, "I chose Robert, did I not? When that hard day came, I chose blood over honor."
So yeah, like he sees it as, almost dishonorable, which is weird. But it's not weird making, but that, because I don't know. I guess it is kind of weird because then, he sees like people abusing power and he's like, okay, that's not right either. So he should have been totally on board. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, going back to whether he was choosing Aerys or Robert, my opinion is the reason he ultimately chooses Robert is because he's got two ideas of duty, in that, duty to an older brother versus duty to your king, and duty being his central animating purpose or animating value, is ultimately he decides to go with Robert because for the same reason that he abandoned the faith of the Seven. Gods and kings are only owed duty if they're just. So, and also just to kind of use this question to answer a previous question, if Stannis was ambitious, he would have turned over Storm's End to the loyalists.
Right.
And then the host of the Reach and the Red Wines go up to the Trident, and Robert's outnumbered more than I think 3-1, definitely 2-1. And the Battle of the Trident is the laugher, and then Stannis becomes Lord Paramount of the Stormlands.
Right.
So you've got that aspect of it, but so with Renly, and I think Stannis is very, very upset by it. He's very bitter about it. And in the moment, like if he did order Mel to kill Renly, he's certainly furious about it. I think he was going to kill Renly on his own. Like he planned to win the battle at Storm's End by Agincoring, the unsupported vanguard.
I
And
think
then I think he would have executed Renly for treason at that point. But I think he's surprised by how bad he feels about it after.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that could make that actually makes sense. Because I was gonna say I don't know that he would, but that does it because you do see like a big like learning curve with him as far as after his defeat at Blackwater and like the desperation he kind of hits, and then Davos coming in and being Davos and Davos not compromising his morals. Yeah, so I agree with that.
We have some dogs joining the podcast.
I like dogs.
Yeah,
loyal.
I'm dog sitting tonight, so
never liked cats, so we had the cat.
Oh, there's 3 cats here too.
Well, eat them. So why did you go out for food early if you had cats? Come on, buddy.
Oh man.
Right. So
I wanted clams.
All right.
We're
next question. Is Stannis a religious zealot?
Oh no. I mean, he's kind of I think he's just seen like some sort of power from Mel and is kind of like, okay, I'll go along with this if it gets me from A to B. But when he says, I said the words, damn it, and he's just always grinding his teeth every time that Mel's praying. You could just tell he's like he's not
uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, so I think it's a means to an end for him, using her and seeing that, and I think that's more what it is. So yeah, that's all I got with that. But
I think he's and we kind of talked about this in the Danny episode, that he's agnostic post Windproud. He's not saying there are no gods. He's just saying if there are gods, they're dicks, and I'm not going to worship them. And then Mel comes along and just touching on that, how Mel gets to Dragonstone and then ingratiates herself, because the notion that she just knocked on the gates and started saying, "Hey, I have all these prophetic powers for Stannis," I think it would be a laugher for him to just. So that would, I think, if that's not the top, I think that's probably the top question I would ever ask George if I got, to an event with him, is how Mel ingratiated herself in the court on Dragonstone. Because Varys reports because at the end of the Game of Thrones, Tywin says that Stannis sent for a Shadowbinder from a Shy, and that's a report from Varys. So is Varys getting inaccurate information? Because it's very much clear from Mel's POV chapter that she goes to Dragonstone and seeks Stannis out. So the question for me is how she succeeded in that. And so I think with Mel, Stannis is not getting away from that. He's not a zealot because he again, the line from A Dance with Dragons when they're on the march and the zealots who are in his army demand that they give an unbeliever to R'hllor, and he says, "I'll have no burnings, pray harder." So that's pray harder is not a line that you hear from religious zealots. But for him, the data is starting to overwhelm his skepticism, and he's just again, it goes to that great line by Stephen Dillon in the show, when you see it as real as these iron bars, how can you say he's not real?
Right.
So for him, it's like, I don't really want to believe this, and I don't particularly care, but how do you deny it based on all this data? And that's ultimately for him what comes up with Mel.
Right. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects to Stannis' story is the Melisandre. How does she get there? Does she ingratiate herself to Selyse first? If that's the path,
close enough to Selyse is my thing. Like, how does she even?
Right.
Yeah,
that's
sorry,
no, you're fine. You're fine.
Yeah, Selyse is like 3 steps further from the question of how does she even get in.
Well, she's fucking 3 steps further from Stannis as well. Like it's
Yeah.
not like my wife or someone like saying, "Hey, you got to meet this person." Okay, like Stannis is not just going to say, "Okay, Celeste, bring her in." Like, yeah, I really want that, and I can't wait for the Winds to Winter because I think we're going to get obviously
Yeah, I mean,
more
it's making fun of
Melisandre.
more Mel previews, and maybe
Right.
we get that.
I
And
can't wait for more Celeste. I don't know about you guys, but
the mustache.
again, the mustache is just ugh.
do you think do you think Lysa and like Celeste kind of like buddied up at one point? That would be so terrible, but they're almost the same person.
They're both victims of enormous trauma. It's not their fault they're like this.
They're still terrible.
Oh,
But yes,
okay.
they are.
Yeah.
But they're still not a person you want to be in a room with. You know.
Well, some of us could say this. I mean, some in the fandom they would be wrong, but some of us would say the same for Stannis. But I mean, it just let's move on.
Look, I have family members like this, and you know, I feel bad for them, but I still can't be in the same room with them for more than like, you know, it's.
I think that's one of the best, and then I do want to move on. That's one of the best delivered lines by Stephen Delane in the show when they're eating, him and Celeste and Melisandre, and he's throws the meat down and he says the meat's turned, and she says something like he says to serve fish, we live on an island, and she's like, you don't like fish, and he's like, I hate a great many things, but I suffer them all the same. Like, I just think that's so good. All right,
no.
so I want to stick on Melisandre here, and I want to bring Davos back into the discussion. There's that great framing in the show, and obviously we see it throughout the books of and let's just simply describe it as Melisandre on one shoulder and Davos on the other, like the angel and the devil. That everyone knows that imagery. That they're both speaking into Stannis's ears and trying to influence him what to do. I think it's interesting that Davos and Melisandre, in a way, are also, they kind of embody, and maybe this is just a thought that I'm having and won't make sense. They kind of embody two parts of Stannis. One part being Melisandre's tactics, the other being Davos's tactics. But I want to ask this question of, not just, we want to move beyond just good and evil to more complex way that Davos and Melisandre interact with Stannis and influence Stannis. Is Davos sort of the harder but better path toward the throne and the kingdom and the realm, and Melisandre is this faster, easier path to getting what he wants or what he feels he needs to do based on his duty to serve as king?
I maybe, but it seems like when Mel, well, I guess he didn't choose that, but I was gonna say when what happened to Mel, or what happened to Renly, that kind of more like that kind of complicated things for him, because like a lot of people just assume like he sent an assassin and like he just did it dirty and it wasn't honorable. So that kind of complicate, but he didn't really choose that. But other than that, yeah, I think Davos represents maybe the lawful way, but Mel maybe is like, hey, everyone else is not lawful. Let's just kind of, if he uses a little of each, I think he'll go pretty far, and he has. So,
yeah, for Mel, I mean, obviously, George has said that Mel is the most misunderstood character in the books, even above Varys and others. But
which is coming. That's a lot coming from George. Being very anti-religion. So.
Yeah,
or agnostic or atheist or whatever he is, but
I think he's described himself as a spurned Catholic, which has a lot of relevance to the seven. But with Mel, being the misunderstood, I think that's obvious that she's not the evil witch in Disney, and I think you see that very early on, and that she's the one who helps up Crescent after he falls. So she's not the evil witch type character, but then the flip side of that for me is that Davos is not, and I love Davos, and he's like my fourth favorite character, and he's, obviously my favorite POV, but favorite, I guess, mostly because of the Stannis stuff. But the thing is that Davos is not advocating that Stannis stop the war, which would be, kind of a moral pacifistic pace. His argument is that Stannis needs to conduct the war in the right way, but that means people are going to die and innocents are going to die. Davos goes along with attacking, King's Landing. Civilians will die in that scenario. So he's a moral man, but he is, as he described himself to Mel, there are bits of gray in him, and part of that is his devotion to Stannis. I don't think he's wrong in his devotion to Stannis, but he is the devil and angel similar imagery that the show used is kind of very reductionist and in keeping with the show's perspective on these things.
Right. That's a fair point. But I also think in the books you're presented with the fact that it seems like Davos is, and I'm using air quotes here, the better counselor, and Melisandre is, far worse. Obviously, perspective matters, and their histories matter, and why they're doing what they're doing matters, which we'll find out, later in the books. We found out obviously a lot about Davos, but more about Melisandre. But you're right. I mean, the show does simplify it as much as possible. But I just kind of think of it as Melisandre has these gifts that Stannis at first obviously questions, but then becomes not a believer in her religion, but in her abilities. Those gifts to me seem like an easier path, a faster path. Shadow assassins, looking in the flames, figuring out where to go, etc. Even though, obviously a lot of that is not working out. The Davos approach of finding more ships, finding more men, getting allies, taking the fight to this region. That's the harder, longer path, even though Davos presents it as the better one, the better to making a king.
In a way, he's not wrong about that, but because you can't win a kingdom with shadow babies alone,
right?
So
and that's why it's probably best that he kind of mix and matches each of their advice and kind of weighs it, and but yeah, if he used Mel, he probably would spare the lives of countless, but
he does. I mean, his use against Renly and Penrose does.
Yeah, but ultimately though, if he kept doing that, like, there's no way he'd have a kingdom. There'd be so many, like, if he even won the throne at that point, like, if he somehow just used Mel all the way, like, I don't think he'd be able to hold on to the kingdom, because so many people would be, they would just, there'd be something about him, like, yeah, all the leaders that went up against him died. So, I feel like there'd be more, that would just cause more unrest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to move toward some final questions here, specifically about Stannis's endgame and what will happen. In part one, we talked about the fact that we think he's going to win the Battle of Ice and he's going to take Winterfell. Well, what happens after that, specifically with Shireen? And there's some people out there that think that I don't know if it's a view that they don't want Stannis to sacrifice Shireen, or they think that the show just conveniently created this scenario to happen. Whether it's they just don't want to see one of their characters or one of their favorite characters do that because it's a horrific thing. But there's a lot of precedent in the books, in Stannis's arc, that could potentially lead to this. And obviously we talked in part one about one of the influences that we see in Stannis Baratheon is Agamemnon, who sacrifices his daughter. There's the famous quote that Stannis says to Davos, the fact that if I sacrifice one child to the flames to save a million from the dark, sacrifice is never easy, Davos, or it is no true sacrifice. So let's talk about Shireen, how Stannis gets to the point where Shireen is sacrificed and why. Frank, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, the why is ultimately going to be because the others in the Army of the Dead have breached the wall. There's a variety of theories about that happen. I don't think it'll happen the way it does in the show. But I think the ultimate way that it does happen is Euron blowing the horn of winter that Sam has with him in Old Town, conveniently. And then the wall comes down, and then Stannis, to parallel kind of his role in being besieged in a hopeless situation as he was at Storm's End, he will be besieged in Winterfell, and but this time by the Army of the Dead and the others. And all of his abilities as a martial commander, all of Mel's other tricks won't work, and ultimately Mel's going to come to him and says, look, either we've got these dragon eggs that are under Winterfell, or there's a stone dragon that I can wake, but somehow I can get us or just by burning her, your sword will become an actual Lightbringer and not just a glamour. By doing this, we can actually defeat them. And Stannis is going to be torn between his love for Shireen and his duty as a king. And ultimately, he will be the man, the one man in 10,000 that Aemon talked about that would do that. And George loves showing us the implications of what we as readers want, because he's not just critiquing fantasy as a genre, he's critiquing fantasy readers. So when we say we want Theon to be punished for his awful crimes in Winterfell, well, George is going to make us look at that and say, do you like what you see? And so with Stannis, and what was that, bro?
And I said, and I don't like it.
Yeah, it's gut-wrenching. And even if you think Theon has passed a moral event horizon and he's the worst, the descriptions of the flaying knife and everything else and all the psychological torture that Theon goes through is gut-wrenching. So with Stannis, we say we want leaders who put the realm and the good of the people they rule above themselves and their wants and their family. We don't want nepotism. And Stannis is going to take that to the very extreme and say the realm matters more than my own child. I don't think it'll work, or it'll produce a negative effect like spawning a dragon that the others somehow can control, because of Dany's prophecy where she sees a dragon spitting shadow flame, which kind of parallels the show's portrayal of Viserion with his blue or his eerie bluish flame. So it could very well backfire. It could ultimately fizzle and do nothing. I don't think it's going to lead to anything that will profit Stannis, and I think that's the tragedy. And so the how is Mel is going to burn her on Stannis' order. There has been some speculation that Mel is going to impersonate Davos when she tries to convince him, because of Mel's commentary. It's an offhand comment in her own thoughts where she's saying, in order to make a glamour of Rattleshirt, you need a good glamour has pieces of the other person. So with glamoring Mance as Rattleshirt, she has his old bones and everything else. But while she's thinking of it, she's thinking of, you need a lock of hair, a pair of old boots, a bag of finger bones. And that's just really weird for her to think about that.
Right.
But the problem with that is that Davos lost those fingers in Blackwater, and how in the world would it would be a Deus Ex Machina for her to have somehow acquired those.
Right.
So that's my issue with that particular theory. But ultimately, the why is because of the existential threat of the others. The how is and Stannis will give the order. I do not think it is set up repeatedly with Edric Storm and everything else in Storm of Swords and before it that Stannis will be the one to give the order. It's not going to be Selyse. It's not going to be Mel conspiring behind his back. It will be Stannis, because he is ultimately a hero, but ultimately a tragic hero, and according to some people, not wrongly, a monster for ordering this. So
Yeah. Okay, so who hasn't wanted to sacrifice a child to change the weather at some point? It's been raining here in Georgia, I swear to God, for like 3 to 4 weeks nonstop. Today was the first sunny day, and I am convinced someone sacrificed Shireen, burned a Shireen like person at the stake to change. No, but change the weather. But no, I didn't think about the like Mel's thoughts about the finger bones. And I mean, it's a fantasy, like, and no one, I mean, she was presumably left at Dragonstone, but I don't know if anybody really, I feel like maybe somehow she acquired them. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how that would happen, but
it could
but
just
yeah,
be one of
I feel like she would, that could be a big possibility. Like somehow she glamours herself to convince Stannis to because isn't it? I don't know if it's a show only thing, because I don't remember Davos saying what he said to Stannis, but he's like, Stannis was like, "What's the life of one bastard boy and against a kingdom or something?" And Davos says everything, right?
yes.
Is that show only, or is that in the book?
No, that's in the books. What?
Okay.
It's one. What is one boy against a kingdom?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if Mel were to glamour herself as Davos and then go back on those words, that could be a potential for Stannis to be like, okay, Davos is saying it. He's supposed to be my voice of reason. Because if Davos is hardcore disagreeing with something, I shouldn't do it. And then in that case, you get Davos on board with it. So not him not really being there, but it's a potential. I don't know how she'd get the finger bones, but I don't feel like it's out of the realm of possibilities.
So, and I think most of us believe that the sacrifice will happen at Winterfell. I assume you all think that as well.
Yes, I mean there's some people who think it could happen at the Night Fort because of the Night King imagery
Symbolism,
that surrounds Stannis, and the potential that he does become, because Dany does have the vision in the House of the Undying that she is fighting a blue-eyed king who casts no shadow. And obviously a blue-eyed king could be any person who's turned into a white, but he's also supposed to be wielding a flaming sword. But the cast no shadow part is definitely an allusion to Stannis,
right?
Given how his shadows are kind of taken by Mel for the use of the shadow babies. So that that could very well happen, where Stannis has a mental break, and that's how it ultimately ends up going down. But I think the setup is more for him to be besieged at Winterfell after he takes it, and then be surrounded by the army of the dead, and then as a last resort sacrifice Shireen, and that not to work.
Yeah,
either backfire or not to work at all, and then you have that.
Yeah, and sorry, I was just going to say, and Dany slaying the lie of the blue-eyed king wielding a flaming sword. She doesn't have to be present. She doesn't have to interact with Stannis. Technically, right? Yeah, exactly. The fact that Stannis and Melisandre were saying he was Azor Ahai, he's no longer here. He's dead, and here comes Dany with these dragons. One of I think that this quote that illustrates Stannis's mentality of what's the worth of what's the value of one person versus a million, a billion, however you want to frame it, brings up to me the quote from the Wrath of Khan, when Spock sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise, and he simply says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and Kirk obviously replies, or the one, or actually I think Spock replies, or the one. But that's a self-sacrifice, right? Like Spock made that decision. He made that decision to do it himself. Shireen will obviously not have that ability to. Good.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a lot like the plot of the very first X-Men movie, where Magneto kidnaps a rogue in order to transfer his powers to her in order to like spin up the machine that will hit the world leaders, and it also parallels the fact that it's not going to work because Magneto thinks it's going to turn them into mutants, but the X-Men know it's going to kill them.
Right.
So that's a very interesting parallel in that you do have kind of these two characters who are older but also have a lot of abilities and ultimately who are going to sacrifice someone else for a purpose that some might the mutant brotherhood would think is good, but ultimately others aren't. For me
spoiler, have y'all seen the last Avengers Infinity War?
Yeah, Avengers Infinity. Yeah, I've seen that.
Okay, well, spoiler for anyone who hasn't, skip ahead like 30 seconds. But or we'll say a minute, just and then you can backtrack from there. But anyways, how Captain America says we don't trade lives, but then when it comes to Vision, and then at the end of it, Vision is begging like all hope is lost, and Vision has to be like, you've got to do it, and to the Scarlet Witch.
Yeah, and some people have speculated that like Agamemnon's daughter, it'll be she might be a quote unquote willing, but the fact is she's a child, so any scenario where she would be willing to say yes, father, I'm willing to do this, it doesn't work because she's a minor.
Yeah.
Vision's an adult, and all that situation. So I personally think it's going to be as horrific as it was on the show. It'll be different because of the context,
right?
But so again, it is a question of, it's a very interesting question that I don't think George wants us to have an answer to. In that,
yes, of course,
would you do this? Because for Stannis at that point, the question is not, is it everyone on the planet, and especially in Westeros, versus Shireen? It's Shireen versus everyone on the planet and Westeros and Shireen. Like that's going to be the logic. So it's not a 1-to-1 of a trolley.
Yeah.
She's going to starve and die. And again, I think there is going to be, given the symbolism and the issues that we see in A Dance with Dragons and all the facets that George has layered in about famine in the north and the lack of food, with Littlefinger hoarding food and everything else, I think you're going to see another starvation thing. And if Stannis is going to be ultimately asked, I think this will be a point that Mel makes, is like, do you want to see your daughter starve? Yeah, fire's not a great way to go either, but you starved at Storm's End. Do you want your little girl to go through that?
Right.
So I think it's like, I think we're going to get this from a Mel POV, and it's going to be utterly gut-wrenching.
Yeah.
But it's the context that you have to, that is ultimately going to determine how you view this. And I don't think there's a wrong answer to say no, even in the face of the apocalypse, you can't do this.
Yeah.
Also, I don't think we have to spend too much time on this, but we didn't even mention maybe the possibility of the grayscale outbreak, because the freak out that Mel has, or not Mel, Val, the freak out that Val has seeing Shireen was very, like, it seems out of character for her, but maybe that's the point. Like, she is terrified of that because she's always been like real cool, and like John, seems like he has a crush on her and stuff like that, and then she just like flips her shit at that point when she sees Shireen.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's anything to that, but
just one last point on, and I think I'm the only one on the podcast, unless you all are Robert Baratheon with a bunch of bastards everywhere. I'm the only one on the podcast that has a child, and she is a daughter. And so a year ago, more than a year, like when I saw what happened in the show, I was horrified because it's a terrible thing. I was also really pissed off because obviously I like Stannis, and I hated that it was going down like this, and that he would do this, but also that I knew that, next episode he's going to die. Now I have a completely, obviously different perspective, but I also think about this scenario in the context of if I were confronted with that. And Frank, you perfectly illustrated the fact that the logic that will be thrown at Stannis, the fact that she dies, or guess what? She dies and everyone else dies. I think that's a perfect description of what he will be confronted with. She's going to die either way. And so what does he do as king, as someone who has a duty to protect the realm? And I think that, ultimately it's not because he's ambitious. It's not because he's evil. It's none of those. It's the fact that this is the best scenario that he's presented in order to stop them.
Yeah, and I think and one of the questions that gets thrown out is why don't if Stannis really believes that this will work, why doesn't he put himself in the pyre?
Right.
And I think it goes back to kind of that X-Men analogy that I was making with Magneto. He believes that he needs to be the one who wields the whatever power he's going to gain from this event in order to defeat the others. Because if he sacrifices himself, who's leading the Northern Winterfell remnant against the army of the dead? Is it just, would it be Shireen or someone else? I mean, Richard Thorpe, there's not a lot of great options in terms of military ability to wield whatever power it is Mel tells him he's going to get. So that'll be the logic of why Stannis doesn't do it himself.
All right, so Stannis has sacrificed Shireen. I think you said it that you don't think it will work, obviously, because he's not Azor Ahai, and maybe the magic isn't exactly what Melisandre thinks it is. So what happens in the end to Stannis Baratheon? Where does it happen? Where does he go? Where does he die? What happens after the sacrifice of Shireen?
But I don't know. I don't know if it was it Poor Quentin's. I don't know if it was his original idea or maybe it was B-Fish's. I'm not sure if it was there. They came up with it. But I do like the fact that somehow the claim that Jon figures out who he is, and I don't know how that would go down. But if Jon, because they have some sort of bond there, and I feel like Stannis cares a lot about Jon, just with Jon being so blunt to him. Like, it's kind of like the Davos situation. And I mean, he even offered Jon, you could be king, and Jon turned him down because of his duty.
Well, Lord of Winterfell, not king. There's only one king.
Well, yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. Sorry. But then it's going to turn out the fact that he's king, and then maybe it's like, okay, maybe Jon, I don't know. I don't know how that's all going to play out, but I feel like there's a lot of mutual respect there, especially the beheading of Janos Slynt, which is like the coolest scene ever. The nod that Stannis gives. But I feel like maybe somehow he's going to end up in the Night's Watch, and like he's going to just pledge himself. I don't know what the time frame is. Maybe it doesn't work, but I do like that idea that he becomes Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and kind of takes the duty he felt as a king, but realizes he doesn't have that legal claim anymore, and then does that, and it could come after a Shireen burning. He may not die right after that. I don't know though. Yeah, I don't really know if that could fit in, but I do like that idea. I like the bones of it.
I like the bones of it, and especially as a fan of Stannis, I would like for him to survive.
Yeah,
I think there's a few things that don't make sense in that scenario. Mm-hmm. The fact that if the army of the dead is making it through the wall, will the wall be destroyed? Will the Night's Watch survive? They'll be basically the first line of defense. How does Stannis survive if he does battle the army of the dead? How does he survive that war? I think there's a lot of big hurdles that have to be overcome in order to get there. Personally, I like it because I want Stannis to live, but I'm also I'm comfortable with the character and his end being tragic like that as well, going down and dying, trying to defend the realm, trying to do what he thought was the right thing to do.
I do have some questions though about, like, I know we shouldn't like look at the show for any evidence, but it did. give me a weird thought of like, because someone was joking around how they came through Eastwatch, and they were joking around about like, what, does like Dolor said as Lord Commander even know they came through Eastwatch, or like all the Night's Watchmen like looking towards the wall as that whole army's just invading, and they don't even bother with them, and they're just like, but maybe that's a possibility where they break through that part of, they break through Eastwatch and they kind of bypass the Night's Watch. So
Yeah,
they're kind of
that's possible.
They're kind of storming into the north, but yeah, it's kind of a delayed reaction, and maybe maybe there's like a group of or not zombies, but a group of the undead that come up, but it's not really like a mass force, and they're kind of have to investigate it in some sort of way. Like they're like, that's weird. Why is this happening? And it turns out the army's through a different point of the wall.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I mean, because I'm not even sure like how's the wall coming down. I think it is coming down, but we don't know. The whole thing drops. Part of it drops. There's a lot of open questions for it, but I don't know. That's just a thought I had. Like, that could be a possibility where the Night's Watch don't really know that part of the wall is gone, and they're just still sitting there.
sure.
And then they have to do something at that point.
Yeah,
Which could lead in maybe some of them have to go into the Heart of Winter, because I feel like that might be a in-game type of thing.
yeah, and I think if there's a Night's Watch, is there also a White Walkers or others? Is there still an army of the dead? Like those, to me, the Night's Watch could reform and be something different, obviously, but I just can't see the White Walkers and the army of the dead surviving this conflict.
Yes.
But yeah. So Frank, what do you think about that?
I mean, for me, I think you're going to get another inversion of a cinematic fantasy moment that George has a lot of affection for, and that once, Mel's the sacrifice of Shireen fails, however it fails, whether it's by spawning a dragon that is corrupt or somehow vulnerable to the others, or if it just fizzles and nothing happens, and realizing that he's got nothing but the ashes of his daughter, I think that's going to break Stannis. I mean, ultimately, I do like Brendan B. Fish's essay on Steel Bends that shows the flexibility of Stannis in his ability to, deal with differing circumstances, to deal with different kinds of people, different cultures. But ultimately, the Donal Noy description of Stannis is too poignant. Like it's too loaded with symbolism for George not to come back to it. And I do think that Stannis, this will be something that Stannis will not be able to endure, is the idea that he sacrificed Shireen for nothing, and that will break him, and it will ultimately lead him and potentially his other knights, but maybe it's just him alone, but kind of doing an inversion of where the Rohirrim under King Theoden ride out from Helm's Deep, but there is going to be no salvation. There's going to be no rescue. Right. There's no, Dany's dragons won't be there in time, and ultimately Stannis will ride out to his demise out there. I don't see any way Stannis survives. I mean, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch that's formed again in the aftermath of the Second War for the Dawn, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch who somehow, travels to the Heart of Winter on a suicide mission to help whoever's going there. Maybe that's a possibility, but I don't think by the end of the time that we close the book on A Dream of Spring, or book 8 or whatever it ends up being, I don't think there's any way that Stannis is going to be among the living, or even a white or anything like that by the time we're done. And I just think I think there's a way for George to write that in a very satisfying way, even for the most loyal of Stannermen.
Yeah, and I think one of the first images we get of Stannis is, I think, very telling in the fact that this has always just jumped out to me, that the fact that his hairline, like we said earlier, is like a shadow of a crown on his head. I think that's symbolism for the fact that he'll never wear a crown. Now, you can survive in the scenario of the Night's Watch Lord Commander and never wear a crown, but I think it's the symbolism for the fact that when he relates to Davos, that he saw a king whose crown was burning, and the crown consumed him. I think that that is him dying. That is him going down in the flames, going down. Not the ambition killed him, the duty, the fact that he has to wear, the Shakespeare quote, "Heavy is the crown." That is what destroys him. He was king. He is king, and his duty to the realm is his downfall.
And also, I think, that's got to be a metaphor for just the Game of Thrones in general. I mean, so many people have died either wearing a crown or their pursuit to get the crown and the Iron Throne. You've got, Robert wearing the crown literally destroyed him. Renly's pursuit destroyed him. Just Viserys, literally had a crown of gold that killed him. So,
yeah.
So, just obviously George has different meanings, and he likes to, as we've said before, there's double meaning. So,
right.
But yeah, so that's all I have for that. But.
All right, so I want to begin to close the episode with something a little lighter. Do you all have a favorite quote by Stannis, a favorite quote about Stannis, or a favorite moment in the book with Stannis that you think either captures the essence of this character, or that's just a fun moment that you always go back to when it comes to the One True King? Frank, do you want to start?
Yeah. My favorite quote it's from Stannis, and it's my favorite quote in the books, and it's arguably my favorite quote in all of literature. There's some 1984 quotes that I enjoy, but I think there's other books that I've read that I really enjoy, but no quote for me is as poignant and sums up Stannis, who is my favorite fictional character of all time, as well as I stopped believing in gods the day I saw the wind proud break up across the bay. Any gods so monstrous as to drown my mother and father would never have my worship, I vowed. And I kind of go into this on the Dany episode when we're talking about my personal Song of Ice and Fire story. And for me, it just sums up that Stannis believes so firmly in duty and justice that if the gods are not just, he doesn't owe a duty to them. And that filters into his worldview, kind of as I talked about, that he views his duties as being reciprocal, that he has a duty to those below him just as they have a duty to him, and that applies all the way up to gods. So that's kind of that's my favorite quote, arguably in all of fiction. That's not the funniest quote for me. The funniest quote is when Renly says, Renly and Stannis are having a back and forth about Marjorie, that Stannis is like, your wedding to her is a sham. Like, let's be real here. And he says, well, you'll be pleased. And Renly goes, you'll be pleased to know that she came to me a maid. And then Stannis instantly goes, yeah, in your bed, she's like to die that way. and some people have said that, this is Stannis being homophobic. And certainly I'm not going to try and say that he's not. But I mean, that's arguably the only quote you have for that. And for me, what Stannis is saying is that he's not homophobic. He's just saying this is a lie. You're lying to everyone about this. It's not a problem that you're homosexual, because even out through all the books, Stannis does not make a quip about Renly's sexuality.
No.
So this is the only time he does it. And for me, he's doing it in the context of you're lying to everyone about Marjorie. So that's, to me, that's the funniest quote, because it is an epic burn. And those are my two favorite from him.
He's got that sharp wit. Like, if he wasn't so, like, if he did have a sense of humor, and he probably, I don't know if it's he might have a sense of humor. I don't know, but yeah, he does. I think he does, but he doesn't like you.
It seems unintentional at times.
Yeah, it seems unintentional, but it might not be. I don't know.
Right. All right, Brett. What's your favorite quote or moment?
My favorite moment, and I think I've already mentioned that, is the nod to Jon as he's about to behead Janos Slynt. I think that's just because I think around that time you get Mel talking about how they're alike. Um, they won't ever admit it, or something, something like that, or they're more alike than they'll ever admit or know, or something. And when John has Janos dragged out there and he's about to cut his head off, like, or is it's either before or after, it doesn't really matter, it doesn't change the fact of how awesome that scene is. Just him looking to Stannis as, like, you know almost like a father figure, and Stannis just gives him that nod of approval. Like, John, I think, has wanted that his whole freaking life, and I don't know. It was just a cool scene, I think. So
I think I think it's really cool. I think, and there are so many great quotes. There are so many great moments. It would be hard to go through all of them. I mean, anything with Davos, that the moment Stannis is introduced, I mean, the Clash of Kings prologue to me is one of my favorite chapters in the series. Just when he enters the room and the way Stannis is described is just perfect. But I think I'll relate two moments, or one moment and one quote, and I think that they're top of mind because they're the things I've read most recently. I love that Theon sample chapter from The Winds of Winter. I think that's just so perfect. I'm actually starting to like the Greyjoys a little more, but I love the back and forth between Theon and Stannis. I love the fact that when the Karstarks enter, they realize there's no chair. But Stannis is like, this isn't the Iron Throne, but for now it will suit. And he's just sitting there, and then he just lays them out. And that one Karstark son or grandson says, I can't remember exactly what he says, but he's like, here's what I'm going to do. And he pulls his sword, and then someone chops his arm off, and Stannis doesn't even fucking move. He just sits there and watches. It's great. That's just a great moment. But the fact, or the comment where he makes to Theon, where he says that, why should I fear the bastard? And then he just rattles all the accomplishments. It's just perfect. But there's a quote that I really like from Asha's, one of Asha's chapters in A Dance with Dragons. And I relate this to an extent for, like, why I like the character so much. I think he has a lot of great attributes. I think there's a lot of problematic things that we've discussed here and on other episodes. But I just like that Stannis is relentless. He's not going to stop. Like, in this story, I just like that he will keep going and going and going. And it's not a one-to-one, but it's similar to why I really like Margaret Thatcher, who was called the Iron Lady. And obviously Stannis has that iron will. I don't agree with her politics, but I think that the fact that she laid down a line, she laid down a marker during the Cold War, and she would not bend. I think that that's part of what's appealing to me about Stannis Baratheon, that he just will not stop and he will not give in. And as we've said on this podcast, there's a lot of great qualities to him. And if you're thinking that he's ambitious, if you're thinking that he's evil, we think that you're wrong. But I want to read this quote from Asha in The King's Prize in A Dance with Dragons. His eyes were sunk in deep pits, his close cropped beard no more than a shadow across his hollow cheeks and bony jawbone. Yet there was power in his stare, an iron ferocity that told Asha this man would never, ever turn back from his course. I just love that. I think that perfectly captures who Stannis is as a character.
And it's not like he even, like, is in denial about his situation. He's just like, this is what I'm about, and these are my options, and this is what I'm going to do with those options. It's not like he's in denial about anything. He's just he's just not willing to compromise who he is. I feel like and I say that, but then I think that's why it bothers them so much with Mel, like having Mel around. He's seen the power of Mel, but he's like, like he's always grinding his teeth when she's praying and stuff. So I don't know, but he's
Yeah.
definitely my favorite character. If I were to pick a character, uh, my favorite. He's not a POV character, but he is definitely my favorite character. Cersei is, my favorite POV, but yeah. So
All right, so let's close out the podcast. Let's talk about the fact that, going back to part one, we talked about the human heart and conflict with itself, which is what George is studying in this story.
yes.
And it's not just the sense of war as conflict, or conflict as war, but it's the struggle of choice. It's what path do you take in your life, which is of primary concern to Stannis Baratheon's arc. And there's that, we alluded to it earlier. It's commonly misquoted, but the quote from Shakespeare that describes this struggle for Stannis, and Martin uses it in his own way in A Song of Ice and Fire, and it's from Henry IV, Part 2. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. And Stannis kind of relates that to Davos when he's talking about the sacrifice of Edric Storm. And he's saying, I never asked for this crown. Gold is cold and heavy on the head, but so long as I am the king, I have a duty. And I think that perfectly describes how Stannis views the world. That yes, it's heavy. Yes, I didn't ask for it, but this is what I have to do. I have to do this. This is my duty.
I like the quote too, where he talks about, like, he's like, I don't even know why my brothers wanted that thing,
Yeah.
talking about the Iron Throne, or says something along the lines of that. But I think he knows it's going to be uncomfortable, and he's willing to take that burden on.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
All right. So one final quote. I think that this is pretty relative to George's view of most of the characters in his story. I think it's a recent interview, but it comes from the New York Times. And Martin was quoted. Martin quotes Shakespeare's Julius Caesar from memory. This is from the article, and we'll link it in the show notes and tweet it out as well. So Martin, again, the end of the article, Martin quotes Shakespeare's Julius Caesar from memory. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. Then he adds his own version. We shouldn't forget about the evil that good men do, but we shouldn't forget about the good either, Martin says. I do think a society needs heroes. They don't have to be flawless. And if you are a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, you know for a fact that no character, whether they lean more white or black, not skin color, the moral center of white and black, or they're definitely in that gray area, none of them are flawless. They've all made mistakes. They all have serious flaws. And we believe that Stannis has those flaws, but his arc is one of duty and service, and he's trying in his own way to do what's right for Westeros.
I think what a lot of people maybe miss is Stannis may come across like that, but like an asshole, or he may come across evil, but he's thinking about the kingdom and not he's not thinking about other lords. He's thinking about the people. Whereas you get Tyrion. Tyrion doesn't give a shit about any of the people. You know, like, yeah, he has a hard life, and you know, he kind of, you know, gives Jon Snow some good lessons and all that. But Stannis doesn't even bring that up. He has a mission, and you see that with Jon Snow. Like, Jon Snow kind of, you know, gets in his pity party too, and that Stannis does too at points. But his main focus is the wildlings. You know, like with Jon, you know, he's trying to save people, and so yeah, I mean, that's just who Stannis is. It's not. It's Yeah, he's an asshole, but he is looking out for the good of the realm. You know?
Frank, you have anything else to add?
No, I think we covered it all. Really enjoyed it, guys.
So, Frank, tell everyone where they can find you on social media, on Reddit, all that.
Yeah, so the Stannis essay that I referenced, you know, kind of earlier is going to be on Reddit under the username Sir Donald Peasbury. It's not a character in the books; it's just a made-up name with a kind of ludicrous backstory that you can listen to in the Dany episode. And then on Twitter, I'm just at FRANKBUMB. It's my real name, Frank Bumb. And yeah, that's pretty much where you can find all my ASYF stuff.
All right. Well, Frank, thank you so much for joining us again. For part 1 and part 2 of Stannis at the Gates, an analysis of Stannis Baratheon.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for listening, and thank you, Frank, for joining us on this podcast again. It was a real pleasure to have you on. Please find us and like us on Facebook and Instagram, and follow us on Twitter at Planetos Podcast. You can listen to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, YouTube, and other platforms. You can email us at planetospodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions or ideas. The intro song is
remember, we were going to use
we were going to
use that other music.
So that intro is not this intro, and that'll be in the link down below, or wherever, up, down, and around. And but the outro song, I guess, is going to be the same, and that's by Bleach Garden, and that's called Smack, which will also be in the description. And if it changes, that just look at the links down below. It'll be in the description.
Be in the description, exactly.
Or show notes, as the professionals call it.
The show notes. The professionals at Not a Cast.
Yes. And I've been Brett. You can find me at Homely Pillow on Twitter again.
And I've been your other host, Travis. You can find me on Twitter at Sir_Travis. See you around Planetos.